Did Everquest players hate World of Warcraft?
And now you dare enter my realm. You are not prepared. Prepared.
That is the question posed by none other than Ion Blaze, a fantastic content creator and friend of mine who does a lot of amazing content on EverQuest and EverQuest 2, and I've linked their channel down below. Today, we're going to be reacting to their video, and if you haven't seen how I do react videos, it's not like the traditional kind of like watch the video and react in real time. What we're going to do is we're going to pick out a couple different pieces from the video, and we're actually going to talk about them and give kind of perspective from this side, from my side, the reaction as it were. So if you want to see the full video from Ion Blaze, please, it's linked down below and go check it out. I am not going to be including the full video in this video.
I remember the amount of hate that EQ players spat at WoW. It's a game for kids, it's dumbed down, WoW sucks. That was the majority of what I remember. But those aren't good answers. Why did EverQuest players actually hate WoW?
This is where I have to admit that I was one of those kids. I was deep into EverQuest and I was a fan of the game, perhaps to an unrealistic expectation extent. And when WoW was announced, I was initially upset, not just because of what it might do to my chosen game, EverQuest, but because it also signaled the end of another series that I was also a huge fan of. Warcraft 3, the RTS version of the game. I loved Warcraft 3, not just the base game, which I really enjoyed, but also the creative modifications that people came up with for that game and how it was now over. Custom games that spawned the likes of Dota and League of Legends were just going to end. There was no Warcraft 4 because now you had an MMO. And now, almost 20 years later, there's still no Warcraft 4. But even beyond that, WoW had cartoony graphics, looking every bit as old and outdated as EverQuest did at the time, at least in my opinion. A game that had launched in 1999, 5 years earlier. It was especially stark when compared against what EverQuest 2 was promising, with a huge graphical update. We also heard over on EverQuest that WoW was easy, at least in comparison to EverQuest. It was fast leveling and everyone could solo. Thus the monikers Blaze is talking about here with it being dumbed down and for kids. But we can't ignore the fact that EverQuest was also kind of for kids. I was a kid when I started playing it. It's not to say that adults couldn't play EverQuest, there are plenty of adults that did, but at the time it was still a game that appealed to a very broad group, and children, myself included, were part of that group. So calling WoW for kids didn't make a whole lot of sense looking back at it now, because they both had kids in their marketing plan, obviously. Looking back at it now, with over 20 years of experience playing these games, I think a lot of it came down to fear. I think I was scared. I think a lot of my anger and hatred towards World of Warcraft at the time, and probably a lot of other people, was fear of what it could do. What it could do to the game that we loved, and what it could do to the genre. Now, of course, we didn't know how big of a success WoW was going to be at the time. No one did. But still, at the time, it was a little bit scary to see a competitor to EverQuest, especially one that had a lot of hype around it. with huge beta tests and of course a very big fan base that was interested in the game coming from Warcraft 3, Warcraft 2, and Warcraft, the RTS games. One of the key things that I think a lot of people noticed back then was also that this game, World of Warcraft, was actually getting, you know, some attention that EverQuest wasn't getting. I still remember how incredibly psyched I was when I went into, was it, I don't know, GameStop or whatever the hell it was at that time in a mall of all things, and I saw an EverQuest action figure. That was like the extent of the you know, the public consciousness about EverQuest at the time, with the exception of a documentary talking about the addictive qualities of EverQuest. But World of Warcraft was big. It was already getting notification from the general populace. There was a lot of marketing money going into it. You had high profile names doing commercials for it that we were not prepared to see.
Some smack talking fool's been saying Mr. T can't change the World of Warcraft. He ain't no computer hacker. Well, answer me this, suckers. How do you explain the Mohawk grenade? Yeah, wherever I go, I'm making Warcraft look good.
I'm Chuck Norris, and I approve this game.
World of Warcraft. Try it free at warcraft.com.
World of Warcraft. Try it for free at warcraft.com.
I thought I was bluffing. I've never faked an orgasm in my life.
And I'm a shaman. What's your game?
World of Warcraft, the #1 online game. Try it for free.
What's your game?
But before we go too much into the history of what happened, let's go back into Ion Blaze's video. And about a minute into the video, we realized that Ion Blaze has never actually played World of Warcraft, which is pretty amazing when you're a fan of MMORPGs to never try the largest MMO. I'm excited to see what he has to say about World of Warcraft, giving it the first try in 2023, as I personally succumbed quite a bit earlier. I think about 2007 or 2006, right around the time that the first expansion for World of Warcraft launched. In fact, I still play World of Warcraft now. It is one of my 2 active subscriptions, Everquest and World of Warcraft.
I don't understand the expansions yet, but I picked a server that's on Wrath of the Lich King Classic. I heard it's a really good expansion to start out with. I'm just coming from EverQuest 2, so I'm seeing a huge graphical downgrade, but it's way better than EverQuest 1. There's more animations, it flows smoother, and you actually sheathe your weapons. It's nice.
Blaze was smart here because he's picking the classic version of WoW, the version fans of EverQuest were so divisive against. That's not to say that there aren't grudges or hatred for WoW's current live version from the same players. Hell, even classic WoW players have plenty of hatred and grudges against the live version and what it's become. But at least in the sense what Blaze is going here for, what Ion Blaze is looking to get at, with this harkening back to the fear and hatred that EverQuest players held for World of Warcraft, the classic version is going to be the most reminiscent of what was actually happening at that time.
The quests don't hold your hand as much as I was expecting. You have to actually read the descriptions to know where to go. And the map doesn't do all the guesswork like when I played Elder Scrolls Online years ago. But I really wish it was the default. When you get a quest, like the quest giver will give out all the text, it just takes forever to read it all out. And I didn't know there was an option to speed through it until day 3.
Oh no. Day 3, Blaze? Day 3 without being able to skip through the slow scrolling text. Oh, that must have been brutal. That must have been so freaking brutal. I am sorry. I am so sorry.
It's definitely an on-rails experience. It does not throw you to the wolves like EQ1, and I can see how that made WoW much more accessible, why newer MMOs chose to copy WoW. WoW seems to do a better job than even EQ2 Vanilla, which released just a bit before WoW in 2004, a direct competitor. EQ2 stops guiding you with quest chains around the 20s. It's on you to figure out what to do. But it might just be design differences. EverQuest core design was more towards grouping for experience, whereas WoW appears to be more about doing quests for experience. And I see how this solo-friendly questing system was a brilliant advancement of the genre.
For many people, myself included, WoW was the beginning of the end for the so-called sandbox MMO. And not necessarily in the terms what we think of it right now. considering games like PAX Day with its focus on building and exploration as sandbox. Back in the early 2000s, sandbox was more about just going and playing the game in a myriad of directions. Whether it was Ultima Online, EverQuest, Star Wars Galaxies, or Dark Age of Camelot, you weren't being moved from quest hub to quest hub for experience. Advancement was at times more horizontal, like in Star Wars Galaxies, or more based on grouping up and killing, like EverQuest. WoW introduced a clear and obvious optimal path. Do the quests, get the level and coin. That's it. You followed the straight line in World of Warcraft, from zone to zone to zone, quest to quest to quest. Thus, kind of the ending of the sandbox adjacent era.
Let's talk about how some EverQuest players feel about WoW. I got these comments from the official EverQuest forums.
This is an interesting thing for Blaze to do here, going to the EverQuest forums. It might be a little bit similar to going to the Blizzard forums and asking players there what they think of EverQuest. Though I imagine a bunch of the players on the Blizzard forums have no idea that EverQuest exists. So I want to pause here before we get into the forum ones. I want to ask you and ask you to put it in the comments down below. If you played EverQuest, what were your thoughts on World of Warcraft when it was launching? Or what are your thoughts about it now? And if you never played EverQuest, if you're just here because it said WoW, or you're just here because you like MMORPG content, or me, hi, go ahead and tell us about whatever MMORPG you were playing when World of Warcraft launched, or if you played World of Warcraft when it launched, your experience towards other MMOs in the genre. Did you even know they existed, for example? And for f***'s sake, please don't be toxic.
Personally, I quite enjoyed WoW, but what it lacked was the community EQ had built through hardship and adversity, and that heavy dependence on other players to get pretty much anything done, which worked well when all the servers were heavily populated and became a sore point when they started depopulating quickly.
So this is a really good response, and I think Scoos gets to the key difference here early on, which frustrated EverQuest players. And it's one I noticed playing WoW too, but this is where I'm going to say something a bit controversial for EverQuest players. The lack of community may actually in part be our fault. Yes, WoW built itself up with the ability to solo, but the key components of the game were very social, especially early on. Classic WoW didn't have group finders or raid finders. Guilds were important, and what I've noticed most from talking to players who started with WoW is that they built strong friendships and community playing the game. Players who began their MMO journey with World of Warcraft often talk about similar experiences the way EverQuest players do. Lifelong friends, relationships, guild community accomplishments. Perhaps many of us, myself included, saw the ability to solo in WoW and kind of stopped there. Perhaps we allowed ourselves to be walled off from the more social aspects of WoW due to the preconceived notions of what the game was at launch in 2004 and some of the tools that the game made available. But keep in mind that back in 2004, it was a much more social game than it is in 2023.
It's really difficult to move on from an MMO that feels comfortable. I like WoW as a game, but I never really got settled into such a massive community. EQ is smaller and easier to find and make friends. WoW is in many ways a better game overall than EverQuest, but EQ was 5 years established when WoW launched. Many people stayed with EQ because they had long relationships there. Some stayed for the higher difficulty, some stayed because although WoW had better graphics, they weren't very realistic graphics.
Perhaps this is also the part of why we keep coming back to the same MMOs?
EQ had 2 bad and overtuned expansions in a row, which definitely sent some people looking at the new shiny toy on the market. And at this point, EQ was still a pretty slow-paced game compared to other stuff on the market. Classes were starting to get more abilities, but most combat still boils down to pull a mob here and auto-attack it until it's dead. Heal the tank. Raid mechanics have gotten more complex in previous expansions, but it's a slow process and some people actually don't want more complex mechanics. They want the simplistic gameplay that EQ rolled out from the get-go. A lot of players liked the slower style combat as it allowed them to be more social with their groups, chatting, getting to know people, etc. So transitioning to a game like WoW that expected nearly every class to be button mashing, constantly moving around in dungeons, and generally more Twitch style gameplay was just a big adjustment that some didn't choose to make.
I think Bobby Bick hits the nail on the head here with the key differences in WoW questing and EverQuest, which Ironically, EverQuest actually turns into more like WoW later in its expansions. Current day EverQuest is a lot more like WoW Classic than people may realize. Questing is much more important. Instances are everywhere, and the dungeon camp has long since been replaced by the dungeon crawl. It is not quite the slow-paced game you may remember, at least not at those later expansions. It is a much more streamlined, almost WoW-like game, even to the point where taking on multiple mobs is not as devastating as it once was.
I actually liked WoW when it came out, as did most everyone I played EQ with, and what I and many of my guildmates at the time didn't like and just couldn't get past was the way people that played the game acted. The sense of community and social aspect we were used to with EQ just wasn't there. Players were inherently antisocial, relying more on the semi-automated systems of the game instead of chatting about things. If that was different, I might have actually kept playing for longer than the initial luster.
This is where I have to jump in defense of World of Warcraft. Because again, like I was saying earlier, WoW was still a social game. I like to compare it to the 4 main MMOs I played at the time, all around the early 2000s: Ultima Online, EverQuest, World of Warcraft, and SWG. Of these 4 games, the one I found to be the most antisocial may actually surprise you, because it's a game that actually encouraged being social to get things done due to economic dependence: Ultima Online. In UO, everyone was a potential threat. Whether it was a player killer threat, someone that would loot your body after you died to a mob, or a crafter who was going to take advantage of you. Perhaps it was someone who'd steal your loot because they wanted to rush to get a plot of land to get a house. UO was often very cutthroat. It never felt like you were working toward a shared goal. The next most antisocial game? No, it's still not WoW. For how sandbox and interdependent the game was, Star Wars Galaxies could be very antisocial. Grouping was mostly irrelevant as it was very solo friendly. Shops were all over the place in individual player character homes, but you weren't actually buying it from the player character, you're buying it from NPCs. Meaning while there wasn't a central market or auction house, you still were not exactly playing with other characters. You were not communicating with them, you're just buying from their vendor, much like it was in Ultima Online. Certain things did encourage you to work together, like PvP and the ability to string together dances and instruments in cantinas, but honestly, Star Wars Galaxies was more antisocial game than people may remember. Then, the third game out of the 4 is WoW. That's where you get to WoW with this antisocial scale. And it's largely due to the ability to solo quest, but there wasn't anything preventing you from grouping up, and there was actually incentivization to group up. Classic WoW wasn't so far removed from being as social as EverQuest was. The major parts of the game still required you to work with others, whether that was in PvP, in grouping, or in raiding. Now, of course, the most social game, largely due to the lack of ability to solo and the strong push towards working together towards goals, is going to be EverQuest. If we're completely honest with ourselves, we may look at EverQuest in many ways as being subpar to World of Warcraft in gameplay. Animations, interactivity, latency, things like that were lesser in EverQuest, and that was to be expected. It was an older game. What makes EverQuest so special isn't just the gameplay though. It's that the game worked like a very pretty and interactive chat room. Meditation downtime meant you had time to talk. The threat of massive pulls and the need for CC meant communication was important. EverQuest fostered communication and socializing through its very gameplay loop. World of Warcraft chipped away at it, but WoW did not start off as inherently antisocial the way that we were viewing it. I think that's kind of been tinted from how we view World of Warcraft now. There is a lot of antisocial in World of Warcraft, and a lot of that comes down to things like the group finder, things that have taken away the need to communicate, like making creatures just simple and easy to slaughter, and making soloing being really one of the best ways, if not the best way, to level through the game. But that's not how the game started.
Third, we felt WoW was a player versus player game that had player versus environment added onto it. With what I mean, a player versus player game needs classes to be balanced against each other, which for us made the game very dull. In a full player versus environment game, you get several classes that have very specific skill sets which are almost useless against other players, but very important against the environment. And lastly, the split between Alliance and Horde really turned us off in two ways. One, it basically meant when you played on alt on the other side, you could not group with your friends all of a sudden. And two, because making two sides in the game leads to childish stuff like annoying the other side or killing quest mobs and things.
Okay, so this is a very valid point between the games, and especially even with EverQuest 2. When EverQuest 2 released their PvP battlegrounds years ago, they were so horrifically bad, they eventually scrapped them. Classes were impossible to balance, both from gear perspectives and just plain abilities. EverQuest was similar. It was a PvE game with PvP thrown in, the way LaCroix is water with a hint of flavor. Basically, not really there. They tried balancing PvP for a while, removing things like the ability to fear and some other CC, but eventually gave up on it. And no, I'm sorry, I do not think that we're ever going to get a PvP progression server. Now, a event server from EverQuest, that may be possible. If we get like a couple month event of PvP on a server where you get rewards for going and doing things, I think that would be amazing for EverQuest, and it might help all the fans of the Zex servers that feel kind of forgotten about EverQuest. So Daybreak, if you're listening, please, what about an event server? Just a short-term event server for PvP. Let people go have fun. You're already doing it in EverQuest 2. Give it a shot in EverQuest. What's it gonna harm? But what is Blaze come up with? What is Blaze's final thoughts on this? What is his conclusion after getting feedback from Everquest players, after confronting his own bias as he went and played World of Warcraft with an open mind? What did Blaze come up with? What were his final thoughts? I think he sums it up pretty well.
But I feel if a new MMO had the accessibility of WoW combined with the positive social interaction of EverQuest, it could be the WoW killer everyone's been waiting for, but I have no clue how to make it. It seems like accessibility for solo play and encouraging player interaction can't exist together. It's almost as if there's two separate types of MMO now, like social and then solo MMOs. But the money is overwhelmingly in solo play. I enjoy playing WoW solo, but it got a lot better when I joined a guild, kind of like what happened in my EQ2 review. I didn't enjoy the game until I got into a good guild. I was wrong to hate World of Warcraft though. It is better than EverQuest in most ways, but EverQuest still holds a place in my heart for the few things that it does do better. Just out of nostalgia alone, it is my favorite game, but there are better games than it.
World of Warcraft, in many ways, objective ways, was a better game than EverQuest. It didn't find success just by being lucky. It did have a lot of luck to it, like hitting at the right time and growing into a market that was maturing as well. But there's a lot about WoW that we kind of take for granted. A lot of the decisions made by Blizzard back in 2004 that were excellent decisions that SOE fumbled when they tried to make EverQuest 2, and perhaps even worse, trying to split their own game into two different parts when you had EverQuest and EverQuest 2, trying to make both of those games compete directly with World of Warcraft, a game that already had an established IP and was made more accessible to more people by having lower graphic limitations and a easier ramp up of difficulty. But in the process of growth and evolution, both World of Warcraft and EverQuest have changed a lot in the years since. They no longer have the exact same identities they did in the first place. There are a reason why WoW Classic exists, why Project 1999 exists for EverQuest, and why progression servers on EverQuest have been such a hit, and perhaps increased the longevity of the game far longer than it would have lasted otherwise. Players like myself continue to cycle through progression servers on EverQuest because it brings back some of that socialization in the game that is what drew us to it in the first place. Players grouping up, finding new friends, reconnecting with old ones to take on the challenge of all different kind of enemies that some you fought before and some you may not have fought before, as you get to experience expansions that launch while you weren't playing. But even that has seen an influx of players trying to strip some of the joy from that with the idea of farming chrono and WoW tokens. Both of these games are suffering from similar ailments at this point, ailments that are long lasting and don't have easy fixes. Both of these games have also lost some of that social identity in the more recent expansions, with less socialization, less need to group, more focus on questing, and more focus on quick and faster achievements. There are definitely players that enjoy that. They continue to thrive, and it's not like that's not a valid playstyle. It's just a simple fact that EverQuest and WoW Classic are very different from what they are today. There has been a lot more similarity in the trajectories of these games than we like to think. But WoW may have had an outsized impact on the MMORPG genre. In fact, one might even say that World of Warcraft in 2004, when it launched, killed the MMO genre. And I covered that in a video here, so if you want to see what the hell I'm talking about, go ahead and take a look over there. Thank you so much for watching. Thank you, Ion Blaze, for letting me react to this video. Please, again, go check out his video below, and I appreciate you being here. Thank you for watching, and I'll talk to you again soon.